My name is Captain Bella Mason. I'm 29 years old, and my wedding night became a public trial where I was the accused. In front of 200 guests at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., my father, Senator William Mason, raised his champagne flute. With a picture-perfect smile for the cameras, he began. My daughter, Bella, has always been brilliant. He paused, looked directly at me, and delivered the final blow. At filling out the reports for the real heroes. The room erupted in polite political laughter. But to me, it was the sound of humiliation. Next to him, my mother gave a slight nod, a resigned smile on her lips, as if she agreed my role was just that. He had no idea that just last week, I had returned from a field mission that left me with a 3-inch scar hidden beneath the layers of this wedding dress. My desk job had almost cost me my life. But they didn't know what was coming. They thought they were burying me, but they didn't realize I was a seed. If you have ever been made to feel invisible by your own family, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Hit subscribe and get ready for a story about how a silent soldier took back her own legacy. For a fleeting, perfect moment, I wasn't a soldier. I was just a bride. The grand ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel was a world away from sterile command centers and the grit of forward operating bases. The air, thick with the scent of white lilies and expensive champagne, felt like a foreign country. A soft jazz trio played in the corner, their notes weaving through the low hum of conversations among DC's elite. It was a scene meticulously crafted for influence, a classic Washington power gathering disguised as a family celebration. But for one night, I told myself, it was mine. My hand rested in Ethan's, his warmth a steady anchor in this glittering, unfamiliar sea. I looked at my husband, the man who saw past the senator's daughter and the army captain to see just me. His eyes, full of a quiet, unwavering belief, were my safe harbor. In my Vera Wang gown, a dress that felt more like a costume than my own skin, I allowed the fragile, dangerous feeling of happiness to settle over me. It was a rare and precious commodity, and I was determined to guard it fiercely, at least until the night was over. Tonight, there were no strategic assessments, no threat matrices, no carefully calculated risks. There was only this room, this man, this brief, beautiful peace. It was the calm before a storm I should have known was coming. Then, my father, Senator William Mason, stepped onto the stage. The room fell into a respectful hush. He commanded attention effortlessly, a master of the political stage. The spotlight caught the silver in his hair and the practiced, charismatic smile that had won him 3 elections. He was in his element, holding court. Friends, colleagues, esteemed guests, he began, his voice resonating with practiced warmth. Tonight, we are here to celebrate a union. The union of my daughter, Bella, and this fine young man, Ethan. He gestured toward us, and a wave of polite applause rippled through the room. He started with the charming, well-worn anecdotes of my childhood, each one polished to a high sheen for public consumption. He told the story of how I was obsessed with my G.I. Joe dolls. The crowd chuckled warmly. A budding military mind, you might think, he said with a wink. Then came the subtle, dismissive twist. But of course, she was mostly interested in arranging them perfectly on her bookshelf. Always so organized, my Bella. The laughter this time was a little louder. It was a gentle jab, painting me as a meticulous, slightly obsessive girl playing with toys, not a future strategist studying them. It was his signature move, a compliment wrapped around a diminishment. He continued, praising my intelligence, my graduation from West Point. Brilliant girl, he declared, his voice swelling with performative pride. Top of her class in analytics. That mind of hers is a real asset to our armed forces. He paused, letting the praise hang in the air for a moment before delivering the punchline. It makes her exceptionally good with paperwork, an unsung but vital part of any operation. I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine. He knew. He understood the subtle poison in my father's words. My father wasn't celebrating me. He was curating me, shaping my narrative into one that fit his world. In his story, I was an accessory, a smart but harmless supporting character in the grand drama of real, heroic men. Men like him. Then came the toast. The moment that would shatter the fragile peace I had so desperately tried to hold on to. He raised his glass, his eyes sweeping across the room before landing on me. The camera flashes intensified. "So I ask you all to join me in raising a glass," he boomed. "To my daughter, Captain Bella Mason, a woman who has always been brilliant." He paused for dramatic effect, that perfect smile never faltering. And then, he delivered the killing blow. "At filling out the reports for the real heroes." The line landed, and the room erupted. It wasn't malicious laughter. It was worse. It was the polite, conditioned laughter of people who understood the joke was on me but wouldn't dare challenge the man telling it. It was the sound of my life's work, my sacrifices, being reduced to a punchline for their amusement. My gaze shot across the room to a table near the front where my former commanding officer, a 3-star general, was seated with other senior military officials. The general wasn't laughing. He didn't even smile. His face was a mask of stern neutrality as he slowly lowered his gaze to his half-eaten plate of sea beef. His silence, in that moment, was a verdict. It was a quiet, profound acknowledgement of the lie my father had just told, and it was more damning than any shout. I felt the blood drain from my face. A cold wave washed over me, the chill seeping deep into my bones. A cold that not even the heavy silk of my Vera Wang could warm. The grand ballroom, moments before so full of light and music, suddenly felt airless, suffocating. This wasn't just shame, it was erasure. In front of my husband, my colleagues, and the men and women I respected most in the world, my father had just erased me. Ethan leaned in, his voice a fierce, protective whisper in my ear. "We can leave right now. Say the word, and we're gone." His offer was a lifeline, a tangible escape from the wreckage. For a second, I wanted to take it. I wanted to run. But then another hand, cool and delicate, rested on my other arm. My mother's. I turned to see her smiling that same practiced, pained smile she wore at all of my father's public events. Her eyes pleaded with me. "Just smile, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the fading laughter. "Don't make a scene." Her words were meant to soothe, but they felt like a second assault. Her plea for silence, for propriety, was a betrayal deeper than my father's public execution. He was the enemy I knew. Her complicity was the unexpected knife in the back. Something inside me shifted. The hurt, the shock, the years of accumulated pain. They didn't disappear, but they crystallized. They hardened from a messy, chaotic emotion into something cold, sharp, and clear. A decision. I shook my head slightly, a silent no to Ethan. I straightened my back. I turned my face back towards the stage, towards my father, and I smiled. It wasn't a genuine smile. It was a smile forged in the discipline of West Point, a mask honed through years of navigating my father's world. It was a smile that conceded nothing. I would not run. I would not make a scene, because this was no longer a party. My training, the instincts I relied on in the field, took over. My mind began to scan the room, not as a bride, but as an intelligence officer. I assessed the terrain. I identified assets and hostiles. I saw the general's silent disapproval as a potential point of leverage. I saw the journalists scribbling notes as vectors of information. My wedding reception had become a battle space, and my father had just fired the first shot. Standing there, in my white dress, a symbol of new beginnings, I made a silent vow. He had built his entire career on crafting narratives, on telling stories where he was the hero. And for 29 years, I had been a silent character in his script. This would be the last time he would tell his story with my silence. The silence in the hotel suite was a stark contrast to the polite laughter still echoing in my ears. The wedding was over, the guests gone. Ethan was downstairs handling the final arrangements, leaving me alone with the aftermath. My Vera Wang gown lay pooled on a chair, a silk and lace casualty of the evening's battle. I moved through the room on autopilot, my body aching with a weariness from more than just the long day. In my overnight bag, I found a long, velvet box. Inside, nestled in satin, was the Mont Blanc fountain pen my father had given me for Christmas years ago. It was heavy, cold, and gleaming. It wasn't just a pen. It was a symbol, a perfectly engineered instrument of humiliation. Holding it, the polished facade of the night crumbled, and the memories I'd spent years suppressing came flooding back. It was Christmas morning in our pristine McLean, Virginia home. The tree was extravagantly decorated, the fire crackled, and the air smelled of pine and my mother's cinnamon rolls. My extended family was gathered, all performing their roles in the perfect political family portrait. I was home on leave from West Point, the grueling beast barracks finally behind me, exhausted but proud. My father handed me the beautifully wrapped box with a flourish. "For my brilliant daughter, the future leader," he announced. I felt a rare flicker of hope. Maybe this time he saw me. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was the pen, an undeniably beautiful object. "A Mont Blanc," he said, his voice booming with performative generosity. "So you can take better notes for your commanding officers, sweetheart." A ripple of polite chuckles went through the family. No one questioned the cruelty. The gift wasn't a celebration of my future leadership, it was a definition of it. It was a gilded cage, reminding me of the place he had assigned me, a glorified secretary. The pen felt like a lead weight in my hand, its value a measure of my insignificance. That feeling of being minimized wasn't reserved for holidays. It was most potent during our annual Thanksgiving dinners. I remember one a few years ago, back from a grueling training rotation. The house was filled with the warm smells of roast turkey, a stark contrast to the cold ambition in the dining room. My father was holding court with a visiting congressman, a predictable dance of policy and power. I tried to join in, to share a story from training, a tactical problem we'd solved, a moment of real leadership. We were running a simulation, and my team— "Later, honey," my father cut in, not even looking at me. He waved a dismissive hand. "We're talking about important things." He then turned back to the congressman, smiling. "You know, Bella loves her work in the Army. I was just talking to General Smith the other day. Pulled a few strings to make sure she got a safe assignment. Nothing too strenuous. We have to look out for our girls, don't we?" He made my career sound like a favor he granted, a hobby he indulged. He stripped away the pre-dawn marches, the sleepless nights of study, the sheer grit it had taken to survive. He painted me as a child playing dress-up, protected by her powerful father. My voice died in my throat. I was a ghost at my own family's table, visible only when it served his narrative. But being invisible was one thing. Being a shadow was another. The true anchor of my father's world, his real legacy, had always been my older brother, Daniel, who died in a car accident at 17. He was the high school quarterback, the golden boy, frozen forever in perfect, youthful glory. One afternoon, I was in my father's home office, a mahogany-paneled shrine to himself. But one wall was not for him. It was Daniel's wall. It was covered in framed photos. Daniel in his football uniform holding a trophy, Daniel shaking hands with the governor, Daniel with his perfect, easy smile. A memorial to a future that never was. Tucked in the very bottom corner, almost obscured by a larger team photo, was a single, small 5x7 frame. It was me, on graduation day at West Point, in my dress grays. The only photo of me on the wall. My father walked in and found me standing there. He followed my gaze to the wall, his expression softening, but not for me. "Daniel," he said, his voice thick with pride and old grief. Now, he was born for great things. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was, to him, the truth. A eulogy for his lost son that also served as a quiet, brutal verdict on his living daughter. I would never be enough. I could never measure up to the ghost of the boy who was born for greatness. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that explained everything, came from my mother. It happened in the kitchen, her domain. She was polishing silver for a dinner party, her hands moving in brisk, efficient circles, her back to me. It was a rare moment we were alone without my father's suffocating presence. Summoning a courage I rarely felt, I asked her, "Why does he do it, Mom? Why does he always have to put me down?" She didn't stop her work. The rhythmic scrape of the cloth against silver was the only sound for a long moment. Then, her voice low and brittle, she spoke. "Don't try to prove yourself to him, Bella. she said, still not looking at me. The more you accomplish, the more he'll try to tear you down. Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She finally stopped polishing and set the fork down. She turned, and for the first time, I saw the deep, settled exhaustion in her eyes. It was a kind of grief I had never recognized before. Because you remind him of me, she said, her voice laced with a bitterness that startled me. You remind him of the woman I could have been. That was the moment I understood the true tragedy of my family. It wasn't just my father's cruelty, but my mother's surrender to it. It was a cycle of resentment and control. And I was just the latest target. If you've ever had that moment of clarity, that painful realization about your own family's dynamics, hit that like button to show you understand. And in the comments below, just type the word clarity if this feeling is familiar to you. Looking at the defeated woman my mother had become, a woman who had traded her own ambitions for a life in a gilded cage, I saw my own possible future. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I couldn't let that happen. Her life was a warning. Her quiet resignation was not peace. It was a slow, lifelong surrender. And I swore to myself, I would never surrender like that. That vow I made in my mother's kitchen, the promise to never surrender, became the foundation of my life. It was a silent, internal declaration of independence. My father thought my decision to go to West Point was an act of rebellion. In truth, it was an act of survival. I wasn't running away from him. I was running toward myself, determined to build an identity so strong that he could no longer define it for me. My first day at West Point set the tone for the entire journey. I remember the relentless, cold August rain, so heavy it felt like a physical weight, plastering my freshly buzzed hair to my scalp. We were low-crawling through mud that was thick and greedy, pulling at my boots, trying to hold me down. A drill sergeant, a man whose voice seemed to be made of gravel and fury, stood over me. His face was inches from mine, his words cutting through the downpour. "You think this is your daddy's country club, Mason?" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You think that name on your back means anything here? It means nothing." That night, on the phone call home, my father's voice was slick with condescending amusement. "Are you sure you can handle this, honey?" he'd asked. "There's no one there to make your bed for you, you know." The contrast was jarring. At West Point, I was being broken down and rebuilt as a soldier, my family name a liability. At home, I was still the fragile daughter, incapable of handling life without his help. I was fighting a two-front war, one against the grueling discipline of the United States Army, and the other against the suffocating disbelief of my own family. I fell into the mud that day, utterly spent. But I got back up, my eyes fixed forward, my resolve hardening into something unbreakable. Years later, that same resolve was tested in a very different kind of mud. I was deployed in Afghanistan, serving as an intelligence officer in a dusty, over-air-conditioned command center that hummed with the constant drone of servers. We received a sudden influx of chatter, fragmented intel pointing to a potential coordinated attack on a nearby convoy. In the emergency briefing, I was the only woman at the table, surrounded by older, field-hardened officers. I presented my analysis, connecting disparate pieces of information to outline a clear and imminent threat. A full-bird colonel, a man with a weathered face and an air of weary authority, listened with thinly veiled impatience. When I finished, he gave a curt nod. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his tone dismissive. "But let's let the guys with boots on the ground handle this." He turned to the others, effectively erasing me from the conversation. That night, I didn't sleep. Fueled by black coffee and a stubborn refusal to be wrong, I sat alone in the quiet hum of the command center. I cross-referenced signal intercepts with informant logs and satellite imagery, digging deeper and deeper into the raw data. Around 0300, I found it. A single, overlooked detail that confirmed the time and location of the ambush. It was irrefutable. I took my findings directly to the base commander, bypassing the dismissive colonel. He listened, looked at my evidence, and reluctantly diverted the convoy. The attack happened exactly where and when I said it would, hitting an empty stretch of road. Lives were saved. There was no public praise, no medal. The next day, the base commander simply gave me a quiet, acknowledging nod as we passed in the hallway. It was a lonely, silent victory. But it was mine. I thought, perhaps naively, that a success like that might finally earn a different kind of reaction from home. I called my parents, hoping for a sliver of pride. My mother answered, her voice tight with anxiety. "Bella, your father just spoke with General Smith," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "The general mentioned your contribution. Your father is worried. He said you were a little too aggressive. Honey, in the army, a woman needs to be agreeable, not forceful." Her words were a gut punch. My life-saving analysis had been filtered through my father's political connections and repackaged as a character flaw. A minor error I'd made months prior was now, according to him, part of a pattern of immaturity, a story he was already spinning to his contacts on the Hill. Instead of encouragement, I received a lecture on how to be a more palatable version of a female soldier, all delivered under the guise of motherly concern. After that call, I felt a profound sense of isolation. It was then that I picked up a worn paperback I kept with me on deployment, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I read a passage that had become my creed. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. I realized then that I couldn't change my family. I couldn't make them see me or value my work, but I could change how I derived my own worth. It couldn't come from them. It had to be built from within, forged in my own actions and my own integrity. The most powerful proof of that came from the most unexpected source. On my final tour, I worked with a master sergeant everyone called Pops. He was a quiet, grizzled veteran who had seen everything and rarely spoke more than a dozen words a day. He just watched. One afternoon, our patrol was navigating a treacherous valley when my intel suggested the primary route was a trap. Overruling a more senior lieutenant, I made the difficult call to divert us through a longer, more arduous path. The decision was unpopular, earning me grumbles and resentful glares. 2 hours later, we received word that a massive IED had detonated on the exact stretch of road we had avoided. Later that evening, as I was reviewing after-action reports, Pops walked up to my desk and placed a steaming mug of black, gritty coffee beside me. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze steady and clear. "Good work, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't let anyone tell you different." That was it. No grand speech, no flowery praise, just a simple statement of fact from a man whose respect had to be earned, not given. And in that moment, that simple validation from a fellow soldier meant more than every hollow compliment my father had ever uttered. It was the first brick in a new foundation, a sense of self-worth built not on the shifting sands of my family's approval, but on the solid ground of my own competence and the respect of those who fought alongside me. The respect I earned from Master Sergeant Pops was more than just a single moment of validation. It was a shift in my internal landscape. For the first time, I understood that my value wasn't a verdict handed down by a jury of my family members. It was something I could build myself, piece by piece, through my own actions. That quiet strength, that first brick in my new foundation, was what allowed me to recognize a true ally when he finally appeared. And he appeared, as most pivotal things in my life did, not in a grand ballroom, but in the sterile, high-pressure environment of the Pentagon. The crisis was known as the Aegis Protocol, a sophisticated cyber attack that threatened to cripple our overseas military communications network. I was leading the intelligence response team from a subterranean command center, a windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and ozone. The air was thick with tension, the walls lined with screens displaying cascading lines of code and shifting satellite maps. Into this controlled chaos walked Ethan Crawford. He was a civilian cybersecurity specialist, a contractor brought in for his specific expertise. I remember my first impression. Calm eyes in a face that looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. A quiet confidence that was the complete opposite of my father's booming, attention-seeking charisma. For 72 hours, we barely stopped. I directed the flow of information, analyzed threat vectors, and gave a stream of concise, rapid-fire orders to my team. Ethan didn't try to take over. He didn't offer unsolicited advice or challenge my authority. He simply observed, a silent and steady presence at the edge of the room. When I needed a specific data point, I would turn, and he would already have it on a screen for me. He anticipated my needs, supporting my command without ever trying to supplant it. He saw me not as a senator's daughter, but as a commander in my element. When the breach was finally contained and the immediate threat neutralized, a wave of exhaustion washed over the room. As people started to pack up, Ethan approached me. "I've never seen anyone command a room like that," he said, his voice low but clear. "That was impressive, Captain." It was a simple, direct statement. There was no flattery, no agenda. He wasn't trying to get something from me. He was just acknowledging my competence. And in that moment, hearing those words from him felt more significant than any formal commendation. He was the first person to see my skill before he even knew my last name. Our first date wasn't at some fancy DC restaurant designed to impress. It was at a small 24-hour diner near the Pentagon at 6 in the morning. We were both just coming off a marathon shift, still wearing yesterday's clothes, circles under our eyes. Over greasy eggs and burnt coffee, I found myself talking about military strategy, about the complex game of anticipating an enemy's moves. I was braced for the usual glazed-over expression, the polite but bored nod I got from most men. But Ethan didn't just listen, he engaged. He leaned forward, asking sharp, insightful questions. He challenged one of my assumptions, not to be contrarian, but to genuinely understand my logic. We debated the Punic Wars and modern cyber warfare with the easy energy of two people who had found their intellectual match. I realized, with a jolt of surprise, that I wasn't editing myself. I wasn't Bella Mason, the senator's daughter. I was just Bella, a soldier and a strategist, talking to an equal who was genuinely fascinated by how my mind worked. Bringing him home for a family party felt like leading a lamb into a lion's den. As predicted, my father shook Ethan's hand and immediately launched into a political interrogation, sizing him up, asking about his job, his connections, his potential utility. He steered Ethan into a corner of the living room, completely ignoring the way Ethan's hand was still linked with mine. My mother, in her own way, was just as bad. She pulled me into the kitchen, her voice a worried whisper. "He seems nice, dear. Now don't scare him off with all that military talk." I felt the old familiar shame creeping in. But then something incredible happened. Ethan, seeing the look on my face, politely but firmly excused himself from my father's monologue. He walked back over to me, put his arm around my waist, and spoke loud enough for both my parents to hear. "Senator, Mrs. Mason," he said with a warm smile, "I think the most fascinating thing about Bella is her strategic mind. Honestly, I could listen to her talk about her work all day." It was a public declaration. He wasn't just defending me, he was celebrating the very part of me my family tried to diminish. He drew a line in the sand, standing with me on one side and my parents on the other. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's disapproval, I felt for the first time unconditionally supported. His proposal came a year later, not with a diamond ring on a bended knee, but in our small Arlington apartment, surrounded by stacks of books on military history and cybersecurity. The air smelled of the pasta we had just cooked. He took both of my hands in his expression serious but tender. "Bella," he began, "I don't want to be your whole world. I want to be your ally as you take on the world. I want to be the guy in your corner, cheering you on when you're in command. I want to be your partner." He paused, his grip tightening on my hands. "Will you marry me?" It was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. His proposal wasn't about possession or fairy tales. It was about partnership. It was about respect. It was about building a life not as two halves of a whole, but as two whole individuals choosing to stand together. That night, cooking a simple meal in our tiny kitchen, I felt a profound sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't just a soldier, or a daughter, or a strategist. I was simply and completely loved. The peace Ethan and I had built was a small, quiet sanctuary in a world that had always been loud with the demands of others. For a while, in the bubble of our engagement, I allowed myself to believe that this tranquility could last. I let myself hope that my family, seeing me happy and in a healthy partnership, might finally relent. It was a foolish hope. and it was shattered by a single, crisp phone call from my father's chief of staff. The senator, he informed me, wished to discuss the wedding arrangements. Ethan and I were to be at his Capitol Hill office the next day at 1400 hours. The office was a testament to my father's power. A corner suite with a sweeping view of the National Mall. An American flag stood in one corner, the flag of Virginia in the other. The air was cool and smelled of leather and ambition. My father wasn't sitting behind his large mahogany desk. He was standing before a large easel, on which was mounted a detailed schematic. He greeted us with a politician's smile, warm on the surface but cold underneath. "Bella, Ethan, glad you could make it," he said, gesturing to the chart. "I've had my team draw up a preliminary plan for the reception." It wasn't a wedding plan. It was a battle plan. What he had spread out before us was not a list of flower arrangements or menu options, but a meticulously detailed seating chart of the Mayflower Ballroom, color-coded by political affiliation and media influence. He pointed with a gold pen. "The Washington Post table will be here for optimal viewing. Key donors here to make them feel valued. The Secretary of Defense will be at our table, of course." He went on, his voice filled with strategic excitement, mapping out a campaign event. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Ethan's hand found mine, his grip a silent anchor in the storm I could feel brewing. "Father," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "This is very thorough. But we were hoping for something a bit more personal." He waved a dismissive hand. "Personal is for the ceremony. The reception is about the message." He turned to me, his smile tightening. "And you, my dear, are the star of the show. This wedding will send a powerful message about family values, about tradition, about patriotism. You, in your dress uniform, will be a wonderful image." The air left my lungs. He didn't see a bride, he saw a prop. "I have a wedding dress, Father," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "A Vera Wang." He laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Nobody cares about the dress, Bella. They care about the image of Senator Mason's patriotic military daughter marrying a fine young man. That's the narrative. That's what matters." He had, in one swift, brutal statement, completely erased me. I was not the bride at my own wedding. I was a key asset in his re-election campaign. The drive back to our apartment was silent. I felt a familiar, suffocating anger rising in my chest. I had been foolish to hope. My father hadn't changed. His tactics had just become more ambitious. Later that evening, as I was listening to a Brené Brown talk on my phone, something about the courage to set boundaries, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was my mother. I answered and was immediately met with the sound of her crying. It was a practiced, theatrical sort of sob, one I knew all too well. "Bella," she began, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "I just spoke with your father. I cannot believe how you treated him. Don't you understand the pressure he's under? His whole career, everything we've built, is on the line with this election." "Mother, this is my wedding," I said, my voice flat. "It's more than that, and you know it," she retorted, the tears momentarily forgotten in a flash of irritation. "A tiny scandal, a hint of family discord right now could destroy everything. Why can't you just sacrifice a little for this family? For everything we've given you? It's just a uniform, for God's sake. Is your vanity more important than your father's legacy?" The manipulation was so blatant, so textbook, it was almost insulting. She was taking his monumental selfishness and reframing it as my burden, my responsibility. The weight of her guilt-tripping was a physical thing, pressing down on my chest. I ended the call, my hands shaking not with sadness, but with a cold, clear rage. But the final blow was yet to come. The next day, my father called me directly. There was no pretense in his voice now, no feigned warmth. It was the clipped, commanding tone of a man used to getting his way. "I've tried to be reasonable," he started, his voice like ice. "Your mother is distraught. You are putting this family in an untenable position. This is your last chance to show a minimum of respect." "My respect is earned, not demanded," I said, my own voice colder than I expected. There was a long, chilling pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was laced with a venom that made my blood run cold. "So be it," he said softly. "But understand this. If you cannot find it in yourself to honor this family's needs, then perhaps Daniel's legacy is the only one I have left worth protecting. I will have to seriously reconsider the foundation's funding for the charitable trust in his name. And there it was. The final, unthinkable line had been crossed. He was using the memory of my dead brother, the purest, most sacred thing in our family, as a hostage. He was weaponizing my love for Daniel to blackmail me into submission. It was a move so cruel, so monstrously manipulative, that it transcended anger. It was an act of desecration. I felt something inside me snap. Not break, but snap into place. The years of swallowing my pain, of smiling through the humiliation, of hoping for a change that would never come. It all ended in that single, silent moment. The debate was over. The turmoil was gone. All that was left was a terrifying, absolute clarity. My father's final words hung in the air long after I ended the call, a poison that seeped into the silence of my apartment. Daniel's legacy is the only one I have left worth protecting. It wasn't just a threat, it was a desecration. He had taken the purest memory I had, the unwavering love for my brother, and twisted it into a weapon. He had made Daniel a hostage. A chill, deeper than any I had ever felt on a battlefield, settled into my bones. A cold that started in my gut and spread through my veins until my fingertips were numb. The phone felt heavy and alien in my hand. For a long moment, I just stood there, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound. The anger, the frustration, the years of quiet, gnawing pain. They all burned away in that instant, not into ash, but into something new, something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The emotional responses he expected, the ones he had conditioned me to have, were simply not there. The time for that was over. My body moved with an eerie calm, a precision honed by years of training. I placed the phone back in its cradle, the click echoing in the stillness. I picked up my car keys from the counter, my movements fluid and deliberate, without a single wasted motion. I drove through the familiar streets of Arlington, but I wasn't really seeing them. The city lights of the restaurants and storefronts blurred into streaks of gold and red, a meaningless backdrop to the sharp, focused clarity that was consuming my mind. I didn't have a destination in mind, but some internal compass, forged in duty and loss, knew exactly where to go. I found myself parked on a quiet street, the engine humming softly before I cut it, plunging the car into silence. Before me, rising into the night sky, was the immense, iconic silhouette of the Marine Corps War Memorial, the Iwo Jima Memorial. Under the moonlight, the bronze figures of the soldiers raising the flag on that distant mountain were frozen in a moment of impossible struggle and ultimate triumph. They were more than a statue. They were a monument to honor, to sacrifice, to the sacred idea that some things were worth fighting and dying for, things bigger than one man's ego or his re-election campaign. My father, in his relentless pursuit of power, had forgotten what men like these had fought for. He had forgotten the meaning of honor. In the profound, respectful silence of that place, I remembered. I thought of Daniel, not as a tragic memory, but as he was. His easy laugh, his fierce loyalty, the time he stood up to a bully for me in middle school without a second thought. He had been my protector. Now it was my turn to protect him, to shield his memory from the very man who should have been its most fervent guardian. My own father had turned our shared love into a bargaining chip, and in doing so, he had declared war on the most sacred ground I had. My grief, which had been a heavy, shapeless weight I carried for years, finally crystallized. It was no longer just a source of pain, it was a mission objective. The quiet endurance I had mistaken for strength, for keeping the peace, was, I now realized, a form of complicity. My silence had not been a shield, it had been a permission slip. It had enabled the tyrant in my own home. Sitting there, in the shadow of giants who sacrificed everything for their country, the soldier in me took command. The daughter who had craved her father's approval was gone, a casualty of a war she had just now decided to fight. In her place sat an intelligence officer who had just identified a high-value target. I drove home. The journey back was different. The city lights were no longer a blur, they were sharp, distinct points of light in a grid. My mind was already working, processing, planning. The apartment was quiet when I walked in. Ethan was sitting on the sofa, a book open but unread in his lap, waiting. He didn't rush to me or bombard me with questions. He just watched my face, his expression a mixture of deep concern and unwavering support. He saw the shift in me, the subtle change in my posture, the hardening of my features. He knew. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice soft, but ready. I met his gaze, and for the first time in hours, my own voice felt steady, grounded, and devoid of any tremor. "It's past time," I said. "This isn't a family argument anymore, Ethan. This is a campaign. And for this campaign, I need a trusted operative. Are you in?" I wasn't asking for help. I was recruiting an ally. I wasn't a victim seeking comfort. I was a commander assessing my assets for the coming battle. A slow, determined smile spread across Ethan's face. He closed his book and set it aside. He stood up and walked over to me, taking my hand. There was no hesitation in his touch, only solidarity. "To the bitter end," he said, his voice firm. "What's the first objective, Captain?" That was the moment the switch flipped. The moment the prey decided to become the hunter. It's a feeling of terrifying power when you know you can't go back, and the only way out is through. If you've ever felt that fire ignite inside you, that moment where you decided you were done being silent, hit the like button for every silent warrior out there. And in the comments below, just type the words, "My turn." That night, our living room transformed from a home into a war room. The comforting clutter of our life together, books, a half-finished mug of coffee, a throw blanket, was pushed aside, making way for a cold, focused purpose. I didn't write a letter to my father begging him to reconsider. I didn't call my mother to plead my case. I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dark room. With a few clicks, I created a new encrypted file. I typed the title in bold, block letters, the sound of the keys sharp and definitive in the quiet room. Operation Mayflower. The wedding planner, with its soft color swatches and elegant fonts, was closed and pushed to the far corner of the table, a relic from a different life. This was a new kind of event planning. I began to outline the mission, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Phase 1, Asset and Intelligence Gathering. Phase 2, Battlefield Preparation. Phase 3, Target Neutralization. I was no longer a bride planning the first day of the rest of my life. I was a strategist, meticulously planning the most spectacular overthrow of my life. The creation of the Operation Mayflower file was the start of the war. The fury that had threatened to consume me was now channeled, honed into a single, sharp point of focus. In the military, we have a saying: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in logistics. Ethan and I moved with the quiet, efficient synergy of a two-person intelligence unit, transforming our grief and anger into a detailed, multi-phased operational plan. There would be no emotional outbursts, no impulsive confrontations. My father was a master of public perception and political theater. I would not challenge him on his turf. I would dismantle it from the inside out, using his own weapons against him. Phase 1. Asset and Intelligence Gathering. My first move was to review the official wedding guest list my parents had sent over. It was a roster of DC's elite, a who's who of power brokers, lobbyists, and journalists. I didn't remove a single name. Instead, I made additions. These were not just guests, they were assets. My most important call was to General Mark Thompson, my former commanding officer and the man who had personally signed off on the Aegis Protocol. "General," I said, my voice professionally cordial when he answered. "This is Bella Mason. I know this is last minute, but I'm calling to personally ensure you received your invitation to my wedding." "Of course, Captain. Wouldn't miss it," he replied, his voice warm. "Wonderful," I continued, choosing my words with surgical precision. "My father is planning to give a speech. Knowing him, he'll likely touch on his work on the Armed Services Committee. I just thought, as someone who was instrumental in some of those projects, you might find his perspective illuminating. There was a slight pause. I had planted the seed. The general was a man of integrity. He knew the real story of Aegis. "I'll be there, Bella, front and center." Next, I called two former colleagues from my cyber intelligence unit, the ones who had been in the trenches with me during the Aegis crisis. "No gifts," I told them. "Just your presence. Consider yourselves my witnesses." They understood immediately. My forces were being assembled not with weapons, but with the truth. To reinforce my own resolve, I spent an hour that evening watching old C-SPAN clips of my father. I watched him on the Senate floor, taking sole credit for the Aegis protocol, describing it as a program he had personally spearheaded. I watched him accept an award from a defense contractor for his visionary leadership. Each lie I witnessed was another layer of armor, hardening my heart against any lingering doubt. This was not just about my pain, it was about correcting the official record. Phase 2. Battlefield Preparation. The following evening, Ethan and I spread the seating chart for the Mayflower Ballroom across our living room floor. He had procured the official architectural layout. "This isn't a seating chart," I told him, pointing to the grand stage at the front of the room. "It's a tactical map. The stage is the high ground." We worked for hours, repositioning names like chess pieces on a board. My father had placed his political allies and major donors in the most prominent positions. I changed that. Table 1, directly in front of the stage, in my father's immediate line of sight, was now reserved for General Thompson and a handful of other high-ranking military officials who knew the truth about my work. "They will be the jury," I explained to Ethan, my voice low and focused. "When my father tells his version of the story, their faces, their reactions, or lack thereof, will be a verdict in themselves. Their stony silence will be louder than any accusation I could make." We placed the journalists at tables with a clear view of both my father on the stage and the general's table. We weren't just seating guests, we were directing the narrative. We were setting up a kill box. Phase 3. Technical support and surveillance. Ethan, my brilliant, unassuming operative, handled the technical phase. He was a ghost in the machine, a master of networks and systems. He reached out to a contact he had at a DC event production company. Under the guise of a surprise tribute to the senator from his loving daughter, Ethan arranged for a multi-camera, high-definition live stream of the wedding speeches. The official story was that it was for family members who couldn't attend. The real purpose was to ensure there was an uneditable, public record of what was about to happen. "I have administrative access to the hotel's entire AV system," he told me the night before the wedding, his eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity I found incredibly attractive. "The audio, the lighting, the main projection screen behind the stage. When the time comes," he squeezed my hand, "you just give me the signal." A simple nod. "And I'll make sure the entire world can hear a pin drop in that room." He was my secret weapon, the unseen force that would amplify the truth. My plan was inspired by every classic counterintelligence operation I had ever studied. Use your enemy's arrogance and their own platforms against them. My father wanted a stage. I was going to give him one he would never forget. The night before the wedding, as I was doing a final review of my operational timeline, my laptop chimed with a new email notification. It was from an anonymous encrypted address. The subject line contained a single word: Aegis. My heart stopped. I opened it. The message was brief, just one line of text. "We know the truth. We'll be there. Don't back down." It was signed simply, "The Unnamed Soldiers." Tears pricked my eyes for the first time in days. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, profound relief. It was from my old unit. They knew. They had seen the injustice, and they were silently standing with me. I wasn't fighting alone. My battle was their battle. My truth was their truth. My secret weapon wasn't just my plan or Ethan's technical skill. It was the quiet, unshakable solidarity of an entire community bound by honor. And with that knowledge, I was no longer just a daughter seeking justice. I was a soldier, backed by her platoon, ready for the dawn. I stood by the head table, a bride in a white Vera Wang dress, but I felt the starched collar of my uniform against my neck. My heart was not fluttering with joy. It was beating with the steady, controlled rhythm of a soldier in position, waiting for the signal to advance. The ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel was awash in the soft glow of chandeliers and the scent of lilies. But to me, it was a battlefield I had meticulously prepared. I watched the guests, the senators, the donors, the journalists, mingling with champagne flutes in hand. They were not friends and family, they were the audience, the witnesses, the jury. I glanced at Ethan, who gave me a small, reassuring smile. Across the room, I saw the subtle red recording lights on the cameras Ethan had arranged, silently capturing every angle. My trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the target to walk into it. And then, he did. My father, Senator William Mason, strode onto the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause. He basked in it, a master showman soaking in the adoration of his crowd. He stood at the podium, looking every bit the powerful, charismatic leader he had spent his life crafting. The large screen behind him, intended for a slideshow of my childhood photos, now showed a live feed of his face, with closed captions scrolling in real time at the bottom, a detail he was far too self-absorbed to notice. "My friends, my colleagues," he began, his voice resonating with practiced warmth. "To see my daughter, Bella, so happy tonight. It's a father's greatest joy." He launched into his well-rehearsed speech, filled with charming, self-deprecating anecdotes that all subtly painted me as a sweet but unserious child, playing dress-up in a grown-up's world. He repeated the old tired lines about my safe desk job, about how my intelligence work was mostly keeping the paperwork in order for the real heroes. A polite, scattered laughter rippled through the room. I felt nothing. I simply watched, my eyes cold and analytical. Then, he arrived at the heart of his narrative, the part of the speech I had been waiting for. The Aegis Protocol. "I'll never forget," he said, a paternal chuckle in his voice. "When Bella told me she was working on the Aegis Protocol, I almost laughed out loud." He paused for effect, scanning the room. "My little girl, helping to protect our nation's special forces. How adorable is that?" He stopped, smiling, waiting for the wave of laughter he expected. But it didn't come. Instead, a strange, awkward silence fell over the ballroom. A single cough echoed from the back. The gentle clinking of silverware on china suddenly sounded deafening. I saw heads turn, guests exchanging confused, uncertain glances. My eyes darted to table 1. General Thompson, who had been politely observing, now sat bolt upright in his chair. His jaw was set, his expression grim, his eyes fixed on my father with a look of cold disapproval. That was the signal. I turned my head slightly and met Ethan's gaze across the room. I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. The operation was a go. Ethan stood up. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace, walking not to the main podium, but to the secondary microphone on the side of the stage, the one reserved for questions. He waited for the spotlight to find him. "Senator, a truly inspiring story," Ethan said, his voice perfectly level, yet carrying a chill that cut through the room's warmth. "But perhaps you could clarify a minor detail for us. Could you tell everyone here tonight who the lead author of the Aegis Protocol was?" A flicker of confusion crossed my father's face, quickly masked by a condescending smile. "Well, of course," he said smoothly. "It was a team effort, a wonderful team of our nation's finest, whom I was proud to direct from the committee." Ethan didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held his ground. "With all due respect, sir, that's not what I asked," he said, his voice still calm, but now with an edge of steel. "I'm looking for a name. The name of the person who spent 72 hours straight in a command center, who wrote the critical code, who commanded the response team and personally averted a national disaster. Who was that person, Senator?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. My father's smile faltered. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked flustered, trapped, the master orator suddenly without a script. He looked out at the sea of faces, no longer adoring, but watchful, waiting. And then, from the front table, came the sound of a chair scraping against the polished floor. General Mark Thompson stood up. He was a tall, imposing man, and his three-star general's uniform seemed to command all the light in the room. He didn't need a microphone. When he spoke, his voice was a commander's voice, a voice that had sent men into battle, a voice that tolerated no ambiguity and no deceit. It boomed through the silent ballroom, clear and irrefutable. That person, the general declared, his eyes locked on my father, was Captain Bella Mason. A collective gasp went through the crowd. I was there, the general continued, his voice ringing with authority. She didn't help, Senator. She led. The Aegis Protocol is her legacy. The main camera, controlled by Ethan's contact, swiveled from the general and zoomed in on my father's face, projecting his every fleeting emotion onto the giant screen for all to see. His face was a mask of disbelief, the blood draining from it until it was a ghastly, pale white. He stared at the general, then his eyes darted around the room, finally landing on me. He looked at me, his daughter, standing there in my wedding dress, and the look in his eyes was the final, devastating blow. It was not the look of a man caught in a lie. It was the look of a king utterly bewildered that his most loyal, most insignificant subject had just led a coup. It was the shock of a man realizing the pawn he had dismissed his entire life had just checkmated him in front of the entire world. The carefully constructed legacy he had spent a lifetime building crumbled to dust in under 60 seconds. The general's words hung in the air, an irrefutable verdict that shattered the grand illusion of the evening. For a moment, the entire ballroom was frozen in a collective, stunned silence. Then, the chaos began. It wasn't loud or explosive, but a quiet, creeping collapse. It started with whispers, a low murmur that spread from table to table like a contagion. Then came the subtle scrape of chairs, the clinking of silverware being set down, the rustle of expensive fabric as guests began to stand. They weren't fleeing in panic, they were simply leaving. The political calculus in the room had shifted, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of this spectacular implosion. I watched it all unfold from my position at the head table, an island of calm in the storm I had created. I saw my mother, her face a mask of horror, not for me, but for the spectacle. She didn't look at me once. Her sole focus was on salvaging the situation. She rushed onto the stage, a frantic hostess trying to manage an unmanageable crisis. She didn't go to her daughter, the bride who had just been vindicated. She went to her husband, the man who had just been exposed. She took his arm, her movements quick and desperate, trying to guide his frozen, statuesque form away from the spotlight. As she led him past my table, her eyes met mine for a fleeting second. They weren't filled with understanding or regret. They were filled with a cold, bitter reproach. It was the look of a co-conspirator whose partner had just confessed, implicating them both. Ethan's hand covered mine. "Are you okay?" he murmured. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like an out-of-body experience. The victory felt less like a fiery triumph and more like a quiet, hollow ache. Most of the guests had melted away by the time my father seemed to regain some semblance of movement. He was sitting alone at a table in a dimly lit corner of the now cavernous-feeling ballroom, a solitary figure amidst the wreckage of his own making. I knew I had to speak to him one last time. I left Ethan's side and walked toward him, the sound of my heels echoing on the marble floor. He looked up as I approached. The mask of the powerful senator was gone. In its place was an old, defeated man. His voice when he spoke was a hoarse, trembling whisper. "Why, Bella?" he asked, the question laced with genuine, pathetic confusion. "After everything, why would you do this to me?" I sat down in the chair opposite him. The scent of wilted lilies and spilled champagne hung in the air. "I didn't do this to you, Father," I said, my voice soft but unwavering. "I did this for me, for Daniel. I just told the truth. Perhaps it's time you tried to get acquainted with it." I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I stood up, turned my back on him, and walked away. Ethan met me at the door, and together we left my wedding reception, leaving my father alone with the consequences of his own legacy. The days that followed were quiet. The DC political gossip machine went into overdrive, of course, but it was all just noise to me. The real battle was happening inside. A few days later, my mother called. There were no tears this time. Her voice was brittle, strained with a forced civility. "Bella," she said, "your father and I think it would be best if we all sat down. A family meeting to reconcile." I thought of the years of forced smiles, of the peace that was just my silent submission. I remembered a passage from the Bible I'd read, the one where Peter asked Jesus how many times he should forgive his brother, and Jesus says 70 times 7. But I also remembered a talk I'd heard from Brené Brown about how true compassion requires setting boundaries. "Mother," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "I will always love you and Dad. But I will not be participating in any more plays. From now on, our relationship will have to be based on truth and respect. If we don't have that, then we have nothing." The silence on the other end of the line was a clear answer. Setting that boundary was the hardest thing I had ever done, harder than West Point, harder than Afghanistan. It was a final, painful acknowledgement that the family I'd always yearned for would never exist. It was a victory that felt like a loss. Then, 2 weeks after the wedding, a plain manila envelope arrived at our apartment. There was no return address. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, there was no long, emotional letter. There was no apology. My father wasn't capable of that. Instead, there was a single sheet of paper. It was a newly declassified official summary of the Aegis Protocol, detailing the timeline of the crisis and the key actions taken. At the bottom of the page, describing the successful outcome, was my father's familiar, arrogant signature. But beneath it, he had written a short, handwritten note. It said, "I reread the report. You were right. With respect, William Mason." 2 words, with respect. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. It was something more tangible, something I had fought my entire life for. It was an acknowledgement, an admission. It was not a father's apology, but it was a senator's surrender. The war was over. And as I held that piece of paper in my hand, I realized that true forgiveness wasn't about absolving him of his sins. It was about releasing myself from the burden of his disrespect. And for the first time, I felt truly, completely free. 1 year later. The nameplate on my desk was new. It was made of a solid polished wood, and the engraved letters were sharp and clear. Major Bella Mason, Strategic Planning Division. The office was an upgrade too. It had a window, a large one that looked out over the sprawling green of the National Mall, with the sharp, clean line of the Washington Monument piercing the sky. The Pentagon, once the setting for some of my loneliest battles, had become a place of quiet purpose. I no longer walked its long, sterile hallways feeling like I had to prove I belonged there. I belonged. I had earned my place, not with my father's name, but with my own. The frantic energy of the past year had settled into a comfortable, steady rhythm. My life with Ethan was not a whirlwind romance. It was a quiet partnership built on shared mugs of coffee in the early morning and the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing to speak. He walked into my office that afternoon, just as I was finishing a report, and placed a steaming ceramic mug next to my keyboard. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorframe, following my gaze out the window. The silence between us was easy, a sanctuary. There was no need to fill it. We had fought our war, and now we were simply enjoying the peace. On the wall opposite my desk, I'd hung 2 framed items. They were the only decorations in the otherwise Spartan office. One was a photograph from our wedding day. It wasn't a formal portrait, but a candid shot taken right after the ceremony, before the chaos of the reception. In it, Ethan and I are looking at each other, laughing, caught in a bubble of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the moment my new life began. The other frame held the single sheet of paper my father had sent me, the declassified summary of the Aegis Protocol with his signature and the handwritten note beneath it. It was a strange thing to frame, perhaps, a reminder of a painful history. Ethan had been surprised when I'd done it. He nodded toward it now, a curious smile on his face. "It's not a war trophy, is it?" he asked softly. I smiled back, a genuine, unforced smile that reached my eyes. "No, I said, shaking my head. It's a peace treaty. Between him and me, yes, but, more importantly, between the person I was and the person I am now. It was a reminder not of the battle, but of the moment the battle ended. It was the physical proof of my liberation. I still saw my father on the news sometimes. He had won his re-election, though by a much smaller margin than predicted. The incident at the wedding had become a quiet, persistent rumor in D.C., a story whispered at cocktail parties that had chipped away at his carefully crafted image of the perfect family man. When I saw his face on the screen, I felt a faint, ghost-like ache, a sad acknowledgement of what we could have been. But the wound no longer had power over me. The scar was there, but it didn't hurt to the touch. It was simply a part of my story, not the whole of it. My legacy, I'd come to understand, was not something that would be defined by him or by any single event. It was something I was building every day, in the work I did and the person I chose to be. The most tangible proof of that came in the form of a soft knock on my office door. A young captain stood in the doorway. She was sharp and intelligent, one of the brightest analysts in her division, but she carried an air of uncertainty, a hesitance I recognized all too well. I invited her in. "Ma'am," she began, her voice quiet, "I have a new threat assessment, and my data points to a conclusion that contradicts my CO's current position. I'm not sure if I should push it. I don't want to make waves." I looked at her talent and her doubt, and I saw a perfect reflection of myself 10 years earlier. I saw the young woman who was afraid to trust her own mind, who had been taught that her voice was a disruption rather than an asset. I saw the daughter who had been told to be agreeable, not forceful. And in that moment, I knew exactly what my purpose was. I had become the person I'd needed so desperately back then. I leaned forward, my voice calm and steady. "Captain," I said, meeting her eyes, "never let anyone else tell your story for you. Your analysis, your truth, backed by data. That is the most powerful weapon you will ever have in this building. Don't be afraid to use it, make the waves." A look of determined clarity dawned on her face. She stood a little taller, nodded, and left with a newfound confidence in her step. Later that evening, long after everyone else had gone home, I stood alone in the quiet of my office. The city lights were beginning to glitter outside my window. I looked at the photo of my husband, the man who had chosen to be my ally. I looked at the framed letter, the peace treaty that had set me free. And finally, I looked at the simple, elegant nameplate on my desk. Major Bella Mason. I had learned that the greatest strength isn't found in the loudest voice or the most dramatic confrontation. It's found in the quiet, unshakable confidence of a person who knows exactly who she is. My legacy wouldn't be carved on a stone monument bearing the Mason name. It was being written in the protocols that saved soldiers' lives, in the quiet integrity of my work, and in the resilient spirit of the next generation of female officers I would help to empower. It was a silent legacy, but it would be impossible to erase. My story taught me that a true legacy isn't something that's given to you. It's something you build for yourself, sometimes from the ashes of what others tried to burn down. This story is for every person who has had to find their own strength when they felt invisible, and for those who know that family is more than just blood. If my journey resonated with you, I would be honored if you shared one word in the comments that defines the legacy you are building for yourself. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and self-made strength.